good. So in many ways, it was probably nice to have the day yesterday. Here we go. It was probably nice to have the day yesterday because I completely reorganized everything. And then it gave me an extra day. What I'd reorganized, it put everything I'd worked on like way down at the bottom of the document. So now I'm ready to give you that class. And so it gave me yesterday to kind of like dive into Uttara Bhadrapada was the big part of it. And a little bit of Uttara Falguni we get into with this today. Oh, let me just get rid of some stuff here. So I don't think we got into Uttara Bhadrapada Hasta last time. And so we'll start there. And this is kind of especially when we look at just the Western star names. Right away when I saw it, I was like, wow, doing Vati. Because you've got Mirachi's ghost and you've got the crow. Andromeda is this anyways, this chained woman, right? Sort of ideal. And then you've got the crow. And so you've got a lot of what to me are very mystical symbols, right? The ghost and the crow, a lot of symbolism almost of that death through the ghost or Mirachi's ghost in some ways. We also get into now, we're getting into the more Saturnius nature of Uttara Bhadrapada rather than Revati. And so here we have in the Hasta, we've got that Saturn moon nature, which is also very Dumvati, right? It's Dumvati is like old widows worship Dumvati in a sense, right? And she's also that warning to us that you better be nice to old widows because they're really crabby and they might seem like they're really weak, but they'll make your life hell. I think that was more an Indian culture. It was probably more of like a warning to towards the mother-in-law sort of idea, or the grandmother-in-laws in the house sort of idea. Anyway, I really liked Mbati. I really get along very well with that sort of energy myself. So um, we don't mind. The thing I like about Dimvati is you can usually call her a crabby bitch and she'll go, yeah, I know. Um, so, but we get into some of that sort of energy. Things are getting a little crabby with this energy. Um, but then we get into the gods here, and we get the serpent of the deep, and we get Savitur, the impeller, the Gayatri. And this kind of goes well because when I picture the Gayatri, I always sort of picture it's like the sun hasn't quite arisen with Savitur, right? It's like you're just seeing the rays of the early morning dawn coming up over the horizon. And I often see this as the ocean horizon, right? So I almost see that as the god of the ocean of the deep coming up in a sense when we see that horizon. So it's quite a lot of just sort of lovely sort of images sort of come to mind when we get this. One of the things that came up in here was it was back in the 1960 Olympics. The Black Power was a big thing. Those guys got on stage with the whole um, Black Power fist. And so that's very like Uttara Bhadrapada and Hasta, right? A little bit of underground, sort of cultish, but with the Hasta, with the courage sort of idea going forward. So we got here still going to be a lot of those themes going on here of the imaginative Pisces realm and that more technical realm of Virgo will still be sort of going on here. Uh, and we get some of that, like Hasta is the moon and the moon in Virgo, I guess you could say in a sense, right? It's that hand, it's that potter's wheel, it's crafting things, it's making things after a long time. The moon is, we forget this about, or at least I do. I always forget this about moon because I always think, oh, the moon, the mama, she's so nice. Um, but she's also the protective bear, right? She also makes police officers as well. That protection of boundaries, that protection of space. And so we'll get some of those. There's some police officers that also have this here as well. Um, there's a great, I almost see a bit of a flip here when we get down to this. Like, Hasta really has that sense of like, hallelujah, right? That sort of release, that that inspiration, right, of the sun rising, and you get all of these sort of themes in Virgo that don't really belong. There reminds me a lot of these tribals I go to in India. And I'm like, oh, what do you believe in? Oh, the sun and the moon. And they look at me, I'm an idiot. Like, is there anything else in this world to believe in? There's only two realities, sun and the moon. And Hasta's kind of that duality. And that's the other thing with this, because we're dealing with the dual, like Pisces and Virgo stuff going on here too. So there's a lot of dualities, and I see that a lot in their personalities, a lot of sort of dual personalities going on with these folks. We mentioned it before earlier on. Um, and here we see it again, and that's a little bit like that even connects with the traveler's personality, right? Now I'm starting to, I didn't notice it so much first class. This class, I'm like, God, Rahu and Ketu. They're just so thick on me. And so I'm into like experiencing all this stuff like I do when I do this research. Um, but there's a lot of that travels as reality. We'll see Joseph Conrad's name come up here as well, and a whole bunch of them. But it's like that you have one identity away and you have one identity at home, right? And these two identities are sort of going on at the same time. And it was interesting to sort of Joseph Conrad was born in maps didn't make much sense there. He was Polish, sort of born what they called Ukraine at the time. It was all ruled by Russia at the time, and his family was sort of independence type movement people, Polish independence kind of thing. And he left, and he sort of regretted leaving because he left. His father was like a real big fighter in the independence movement, and Joseph Conrad took exile. Exile is a huge, huge theme still through all of this. Um, and he took exile, but he sort of regretted that. But then when he wrote from Britain. He wrote in English, and so he talked also um, a lot about the exile, a lot about travel. He traveled all over the world on merchant marines, like up every river and stream you can imagine in Africa way back in the day, and all of that sort of thing. But then he also talked about that experience of like not just writing in like writing in the second language as well, and these sort of things, how you're able to disassociate. He had a nice quote. He sort of said, it's a lot easier to swear in a second language. Um, and there's something very like it's that Pisces almost effect. It's that really deep effect. Like at such a young age, we get slapped for telling these bad words, right? But when you switch to another language as an adult, we have none of that pain. We have none of that sort of like inner fear. And that's some of the stuff that's sort of coming up in Hasta, really starts coming up stronger in the next in when Ketu gets to Uttara Falguni, it starts to come up more that privileged elite. But there is a sense here with Ketu where you don't get in trouble, right? It's like you can swear and there's no connection to that being a bad thing. And so Ketu's sort of doing that in Virgo with poverty, with making wrong life choices even, and just a lot of this stuff where it's like, oh, that's not a big deal. There's no sort of consequence for that. So we get that. Here we get a matching in the sexual animals, and I didn't talk about them in the first class. I don't know why. But here we get a cow and a buffalo. So we seem to get a much better match in the sexual animals than we normally do. And of course, one other thing to keep in mind in this class, that's really a beautiful thing of this class, I think, is that, well, when we think about chart matching, for example, we're always thinking of that polarity, right? That opposite that's across from us. And so when we're looking at all this Rahu and Ketu stuff, we can also keep all that in mind, even when it comes to relationships. It's just how are these opposites going to complement each other, I guess is what we're kind of looking for. And the other thing is, well, ultimately, every planet looks directly across from itself. And so we're going to start to see those themes come up, how all the planets sort of are affecting this polarity. It's really why I wanted to do this first. Some of the next courses I'll go into will be diving into Jupiter and Saturn and these slow moving planets and things like this. But I think getting a sense of this polarity will geez, it'll do us all a lot of good. So we get some confusion here. Um, and this was confusion in my earlier research. I just pulled things from there of what exactly the plants are. And one of the confusions I had with doing that is there's a tree and there's an incense, and they're a little bit separate things. They often overlap, but sometimes they're separate. And so we get some confusion. And so here we're seeing mango on both sides of the fence here. And maybe that is because mango just does such a good job of purifying. We get jasmine, the sweet jasmine of Hasta, and the Indian lilac, neem, same thing. But Indian lilac, they're also very fragrant and very floral. And it's funny, I'm talking about this floral fragrance. Now my nose is going a little bit like that. Um, so there we go like this. So then we get it's interesting here with Uttara Bhadrapada, the place it rules is the snake den. And we get Hasta, which rules the pond. And there's a little bit like you could say the snakes really like both those areas in a lot of ways. Um, get a lot of that, again, that dark sort of mysticism. And to really highlight that, I pulled a quote from Aleister Crowley to kick us off because he has this combination. I slept with faith, and I found a corpse in my arms on awakening. I drank and danced all night with doubt and found her a virgin in the morning. And so, well, he couldn't penetrate doubt, but he could sort of penetrate faith, I think is what he's sort of getting. He could get to the heart of faith in a sense, but he could never get to the heart of his doubt, the darkness. Um, and that heart of darkness, of course, Joseph Conrad as well, has that. I think I talked about him last time. Someone he came up there. So we see someone like Desmond Tutu has this. Another one, I want to call him a very dark prince sort of figure, but there was a lot of civil rights stuff coming up all the way through this, and the transits was civil rights stuff coming up. Once all the women rights stuff went, then the black rights came up. Once we dealt with the black rights, the gay rights came up. Um, so it was just all the sort of steps that we've taken through that. Truth and reconciliation was a big thing that Desmond Tutu came up with here. But it was like, if you want peace, don't talk to your friends, talk to your enemies. Don't raise your voice, prove your argument. Um, it, this is one I think it's caused a lot of controversy. If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen to side with the oppressor. And if an elephant has a foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that and you say you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. So there's a lot of differences that aren't intended to separate, to alienate. We are differently precisely in order to realize our need for one another. And so this idea that our differences need to bring us together, really sort of diving into that injustice of the sixth house, right? And this is the nodal placements, and so they're kind of clouding the issue a little bit. As what happened with this quote that he made here, this one I said, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, this sounds like, well, yeah, of course. How can you remain neutral in situations of injustice? Well, in one sense, it's like a bank robber comes in a bank with a gun, and he's being very unjust to those people and you as well. And well, should you stand up and and defend yourself? And it's maybe not always the best time for that. But in another sense, that quote is ultimately we gave rationale to a lot of the wars that we started breaking out later in the 80s. These were the kind of wars. This is where the elephant started saying, "Oh, that other elephant is stepping on the mouse's tail, and so I need to defend the mouse." And so America started sort of using this rationale to rationalize war. well, you can't remain neutral. And so what seemed like a quote supporting peace became used as a justification for war. And I think it's a very clear sort of sense of how the nodes kind of muddle things up a little bit. So, and we see that even in the a lot of the rights movements as well, where they get sort of they 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 get blown up too big in a sense, right? It starts off as something very noble and very innocuous, and then it really gets blown into something that sort of gets out of control. So Aleister Crowley, wow, what an interesting figure. We all know him for black magic, but it's suspected that he worked for um, government secret intelligence his whole life. So he was a secret intelligence agent, and so part of his what he was doing was a black ops in a sense. He was he's I can't remember if he's Russian or Polish or something like that, but he ended up going over to the USA and instigating on the side of Russia, and then a whole like band of sort of same thing we have going now, and a little bit of McCarthyism like we see now has also sort of come up in through this. But so Alistair Macaulay went in and got in with some Russian agitators in America, and they all got arrested. And of course, Alistair Crowley went back to Britain. And so we see some of that agitation with I guess it's almost like a provocation that we start to see a little bit in with Virgo type things. So, but I love some of his quotes because they're still he's truly a brilliant man. He did travel all over the world, and a lot of these people did this. One of their big things, very similar, we see with the lost class stuff. They study all the religions, right? They're really not bound by any religion. Any of these people, even some of the popes, are very sort of progressive and open. But the whole and sole object of all true magical and mystical training is to become free from every kind of limitation. And these sort of, because we're dealing with Rahu and Ketu, so I'm looking, anytime someone says free from any limitation, I'm like, oh, Ketu. Um, and so, but I'm seeing this theme coming up a lot, like being free from dogma. Krishnamurti has placements that are coming up in today's class. Osho has placements. We see the next name on here as K.N. Rao, one of the great masters of Vedic astrology, but he studied English literature, and so he was studying a lot of this sort of stuff. He's a journalist, or his family was kind of journalists and bank managers. A lot of stuff coming up with second languages, lots of people knowing second languages, multiple languages coming up all the way through this. A lot of them not just knowing second languages, but having to kind of live in second languages, right? Their second languages become their main language sort of idea. There's a lot of these almost kind of these flips in place. I don't know how to say it. We'll come to some of the other things. So we see another like Nostradamus and Alexander Crowley and K.N. Rao. And so we see some really great masters of mysticism and astrology here. Excellent position for astrology. Of course, how could we say it's not with these big gurus here? Um, and so it really focuses. I'm just seeing a quote from K.N. Rao. All these quotes are directly related to astrology. So he's some good quotes but I've I've said similar things. So detailed work in the beginning leads to the habit of looking at an event from various angles and is more elaborate than a medical diagnosis. When the point of saturation is reached, sound predictions can be made with lesser details. Then it's like an experienced doctor in a clinical diagnosis. So he's sort of saying, like, we do all this detailed work in the beginning so we can sort of let go of it, right? And make that diagnosis. And I often talk about the astrology chart being like we're like doctors reading a prognosis report. Sorry, I'm missing a missing a word. But then he also talks about, and this is of course what we're doing in this class, after an event, good or bad, is taking place, whether it's been predicted by an astrologer or not, every conscientious astrologer must examine the data and draw convincing conclusions, even if it's a post-mortem appraisal. It helps in our future predictions, gives us more skill, depths, everything. Just helps us correct our mistakes, discover the chinks in one's astrological armor. And so I didn't even really realize it actually until just when I was doing this little bit, how much he influenced me. He was one I read a bunch of his stuff sort of early on, and like a lot of stuff now, I just haven't really read anything new in a long, long time. Digesting, lots to digest. So Nostradamus gives us a good sort of idea. Can, nothing in the world can one imagine beforehand, not the least thing. Everything is made up of so many unique particulars but that it cannot be foreseen. This is Nostradamus, guys. This is the guru of all the gurus of Western astrology. And he's saying you can't imagine all those particulars beforehand. And so that's like him. He's like, oh, some crazy flying machine is gonna. And so we're speaking in these parables because we can't understand the particulars that are going to be there in the future, right? And so it's kind of funny. On the one hand, Ken and I was saying, like, you're like a scientist, like doing all these details. Um, and I think he's saying we can still work towards that perfection. Same as we're doing, like that's our spiritual practice. We're working towards some kind of ideal or perfection. We won't get there, but that's okay. That's fine. Um, you get someone like Will Smith, he's sort of a character as well. I talked about the languages, like living in a second language. Will Smith, his first thing was the whole Fresh Prince of Bel Air thing, right? He was like the black guy living in rich Bel Air. And so in a way, he also had back then he was hanging out with DJ Jazzy Jeff. He had the whole rap thing going on, right? He was all um I don't know, the whole lingo of the 80s was going on then. And he was sort of living in a Bel Air where he had to speak like a posh guy. So he had these sort of things, these sort of interesting things coming up through these people. Dave Toshi, the inspiration for Dirty Harry and Bullet. Steve McQueen did Bullet. Steve McQueen, we don't hear from him anymore, but he was a lot like Clint Eastwood. All the women like just went crazy for that man once he did anything. Big, tall, strapping, strong. Um, and you see a little bit of that all through this, in a sense. Because you get Steven Crowder, he's very much a Dirty Harry sort of figure. Richard Nixon, in a way, his whole anti-communism was a little bit Dirty Harry. But then I started to see like anti-communism with Dirty Nixon, and Tutu was anti-apartheid, and George Soros and anti-fascist. I started seeing a lot of these sort of anti, but again, it was the nodes, and there's a lot of duality in this placement. And it was almost like at some point, it was like there was a flip, right? Um, so George Soros's anti-fascism becomes fascism, and Desmond Tutu anti-apartheid becomes apartheid, and Richard Nixon's anti-communism becomes well fascism or what he's going against. And so you see that a lot in these through this area where there's that kind of hypocrisy, can I call it, coming up. And then we see it very clearly. Conicella, she was one of the very early sort of back then. I don't think they called it transgender, but she was one of the early transgender showgirls. I think that was way back in the 20s or something like that, right? And that was that sort of same thing. That flip was sort of happening there. Um, and so that I found quite interesting. That went well with like someone like Eric Prince, who was like he's the one that leads like all those Blackwater mercenary armies and stuff like this. Like, can't even imagine this guy would be like. Um, Jimmy Cavall, he played Jesus and one of the things, and he's quite a few actors started coming out like this where they were quite Christian. And I think he's one of these actors, like he won't take his shirt off in a love scene kind of idea, and very I said in the last class, I'm like, I don't know very many. Like everybody I know is very strong and independent and racy. I said women, but men as well. But then I started to realize you get this guys like Jimmy Cavell as well, and in actors who at least, and again, I have no idea about the truth of any of these people, but at least they make the image of some purity in Hollywood, you could say. There was another couple people will come up later on. Oh, the wife of Kathleen of Aragon, the wife of King Henry VIII. She was also quite beloved by the people and said to have stayed quite chaste her whole life and believed herself to have remained the queen. Um, but she would have remained quite a good girl because Henry VIII was busy beheading a lot of his other wives. Um, so so we get some of that going on. So we saw a little bit as we come into the transits here, some driverless cars, horseless carriages, this sort of stuff came up all through the Uttara Bhadrapada. A lot of like well, this almost related with the next nakshatra, but what I wanted to say was like wormholes, a lot of underground transit systems. There was a lot through here, like London Underground, New York Underground, central stations seem to be a big thing. And I don't know if this was the Hasta influence, but like think of a lot of these central downtown train stations, they all open like quite a few hours before the sunrise is really in a Hasta time, right? They get up at that very early hour, that super early arising. And I get a sense a lot of these people do actually. Like I think it's more in the next transit we get into like Osho and Krishnamurti, but we get into almost a very, even if they are spiritual and astrologers, they're very almost that military discipline. And it might be the Saturnius nature of this. A lot of them are really raised with a lot of very, very strong discipline here. And so even if they're very spiritual, they're not really very flaky. They're getting up before dawn almost, right? That idea of getting up and they're getting through their day and getting their day kind of done. Um, we see at the top here, we see Twitter came into existence the last time this transit went by. UN Human Rights Council came into about. Hamas won a big election back in those days as well. With Twitter, there was another one that came up in an earlier period that was also was a hypertext, they called it. So but an earlier version that allowed sort of Twitter and these live kind of texting apps to come to be, sort of came in, and that relates a little bit with the Uttara Bhadrapada, um, a sense of that. So we see Hamas coming up through all of this. We see some of these, yeah, the Stardust mission, the first to return with dust from a comet, and that's very like that's Hasta. That Hasta like puts it in hand, right? And so NASA went up and actually got that 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 Ketu dust from the comet in hand and brought it back to us, which I found some of these sort of things quite kind of interesting. Um, yeah, there's the Twitter, some space agency probes. Things like Brokeback Mountain comes in, Disney Pixar. Um, I'm starting to put in some of these. I don't really know what's going on with the sports, but I really like it when they have these names like the Seahawks versus the Panthers. Um, there's a I can't help but feel that there's a universal energy going on in some of these big sporting events where it's literally the universal energy of the Seahawks versus the universal energy of the Panthers, right? And so I just love the names of these sporting events because to me, I just picture these massive like Tolkien universal battles going on. Um, and there is, in a sense, right? We're going to discover which energy is actually stronger. And in this case, the Seahawks, was it Seahawks that won? Where are they? Yeah, the Seahawks won. And so initially I thought, oh, that must mean the Pisces side, the Rahu was heavier. And then I thought, well, Hasta's sort of rising out of the sea too, Mike. And so I got no answers. That happened to me so many times. I was like, oh, look, it's that. No, no, it's the exact same thing over there. Um, but I think the Disney Pixar sort of stands out here as well because it's that Uttara Bhadrapada, and we talked about where was that? Anyways, Uttara Bhadrapada has a lot to do with the classification of animals and names, and it's sort of these hybrid animals in mythology, but in languages, it's also this hybrid classification, putting different languages together to make new words and putting word ideas the way we do so much with Latin and these, especially our root languages, right? We put two words of them together and we have a new English word. And so that's what Pixar is doing. And Disney really started to do a lot more. And so it's neat to sort of see these sort of things come together. Down in the general timeline, I probably have things that didn't make a lot of sense to me, but there are some little gold nuggets in there still as well. Israel Palestine thing has been going on since what 48 was the first war, and then they say, oh well, then there was another uprising. That was the first of this kind of uprising, and then the first of this uprising. They almost make it seem like it's always a new thing, you could say. Um, I found this interesting. Iran using something like silkworm missiles. Um, seemed very Uttara Bhadrapada to me somehow. Um, Plane landing in the Red Square. They got some massive tornadoes. I was around for that tornado back in Edmonton, Alberta, back in when was I here? I was here in summer of '87, guys, just up the road. One of the first times I was ever up there. Um, so I got to be there for that. But we saw these like first driverless railroads open in London back in the days. Hypertexas, the Power Fist Underground Railways. Apollo 7, it was Apollo 11 that landed on the moon. But you had a whole bunch of these Apollos going up one after the other. Apollo and Hasta, you can't help but make a connection with that somehow. Um, and I think it's actually in the next transit where the men go to the moon. It's in today's version that we get the first step on the moon, anyways. Um, yeah, driverless cars to haul coal sort of idea. So that whole driverless function. So we got the transit coming up right in the next period. And hopefully in the last class, I'm just going to abandon ship on everything else we have to learn. And we'll probably come back to some of this stuff and deal with predictions, right? Because, well, maybe by then we'll know something. Right now, we're just like, right now, to be honest, I'm just like a dumb researcher, right? Just going through things, discovering, going, wow. Um, One of the other things is this, oh, I just saw this. Okay, no, that was the Apollo 7 took the first picture of the Earthrise. So that the sun and the Earth rising as itself. And that's really what Rahu and Ketu are. And so we might sort of see a strong that sort of strong polarity going on there. If he saw the Earth rise from the moon, then it must have been almost an eclipse, right? Because the sun was between the Earth was between him and the sun. So, anyways, it's fun. Um, so we see here the International Association of Classification Societies as well. I talked about languages and all the classifications, and I don't think I have a chart for Aristotle, but he was a great one for classifying things. I don't know if I have a good birth time for him. I'll be looking it up after this class, but I'll bet you Aristotle had placements here. Um, prediction, prediction time on Aristotle. Um, we see Mao Zedong up the mountain and down the villages. This is an interesting. You talked about that changing of places, right? This was a program that took the spoiled kid from the city and sent them out up the mountain into the villages, and it took the little village kids and sent them down to the families of the spoiled kids. Can you imagine such a thing, right? Um, in a way, it's like a dream of sort of. It's like, wow, if I it's it's the same reason I tell Western people to go to India, really, right? You spoiled little kids go to India. It's not working anymore with India. They're getting to be rich, so we need to find a poorer country. Um, but I'm very glad India is becoming rich. There's a Jai Shri Ram. How could I forget this? Um, so this is very political, and I don't mean any political associations to this, but it has a little bit. I think of Rama a little bit when I think of Hasta. And when I think of this, Rama is coming up, and of course the Ayodhya temple in Rama is being inaugurated today, the new one. And we talk about this changing of places. Well, there was a Hindu Ram temple there many, many years ago. And then the Muslims came in about 100, and I'm sure there's good history. Anyways, they came in, they destroyed that, and they built a Muslim temple there. And then, wow, there was a big thing. I got to look up the history on that. I haven't done that. He's bad researcher. But anyways, but then the Hindus came and they came and destroyed that temple. And my Guruji got arrested, so he didn't have to go and do that. Actually, a great story. I think if Dana knows it. Um, but then just now the Hindus have destroyed that Muslim temple and replaced it again with a Hindu temple, a Ram temple, and today's the inauguration of that. And so we talk about this changing of seats, almost like a changing of the guard in a sense. And so that's all going on today, and that's all going on while we study the changing of the seats and Hasta. So some interesting stuff like this. We get back in the 1950s, we get the first VW minibus. Get a lot of this traveling, right? That kind of thing going on. We get also the first broken arrow event, and that was I didn't realize this happened in Canada. That was like a American B-52, or is it? I got it here. A B-36 carrying nuclear weapons crashes off the coast of Canada, becomes the first broken arrow event, and that was sort of this scramble, this loss B-52, and oh my God, are the Soviets going to get our nuclear weapons, and what's going to happen to this nuke? And so we had a little bit of that. I didn't. The other thing is Einstein sort of. This is when he warned about nuclear mutual self-destruction with the nuclear event, and well, in a sense, that's what we see going on with the Ayodhya and the Ram thing, that everybody keeps insisting on putting their temple there is just a path of mutual self-destruction for both Hindus and Muslims, right? And so we get some of these sort of themes that get raised throughout this. Um, oh, there we go. India got its independence back then as well. We saw a little bit of, started to see more of this in the historical terms than I saw it in modern terms. But some of these independence movements, we'll see as well. Taiwan, back when they moved over to Taiwan, and they said, okay, well, we're going to rule China from here. And the skirmish was still going on. Nobody was recognizing Mao. And then finally they said, well, we recognize the Taiwanian leadership as the leaders of all of China. And that's really where, I hate to say this, but that's really where the Taiwanese shot themselves in the foot. They didn't go to Taiwan and say, we're now the leaders of Taiwan, just leave us alone. They went to Taiwan and said, we now rule all of China from here. And Mao kind of said, you're just a bunch of spoiled city boys who need to go to the village. And then so that's what kept the whole China Taiwan thing that was still going on today, right? Um, like they make it today, they make it about Taiwanese independence, but it's really not about that because actually Taiwan wants to rule all of China, and so that's why they don't. Well, that's how they don't. They never claimed independence because they want all their cake, not just some of it. So, anyways, but again, these kind of battles, it's like this sense that Einstein brought up of this mutual assured destruction. just kept coming up, and all of these, right? It's even with the um even with the whole Palestine Israel thing, and war in general, really it is mutually assured destruction in a lot of ways. So we saw here on the previous period, up here India got their independence. We see down here some of the first round tables to start discussing that independence are going on. Um, this is when Mao first declares his Soviet Republic, and then up here we get where was that? Yeah, the Republic of China officially moves to Taiwan. So it's interesting. Mao declares his republic. Following period, Taiwan declares their republic. Um, things like that. You hear a lot in the news, at least my news, it's American news I get, right? They always talk about when America dropped the gold standard, but here's when the UK dropped the gold standard. And Ketu and Hasta, we sing Hasta's Hasta has to do with gold. And so gold was abandoned when Ketu was passing through Hasta. That was kind of an interesting sort of idea to get my head around in a sense, the abandonment of gold. I think there was, maybe it'll be in the next period, big celebration for the Golden Gate Bridge sort of happened when we talk about the gold ideas here. Um, George Washington Bridge is quite a few bridges and canals sort of crossings sort of opened up here. And here's the Panama Canal closing for a couple weeks. First nonstop flights. I talked about the circumnavigation in the last period. A lot of that was still going on here. The first circumnavigation of North America happened with this. Panama Canal was probably fairly open here. Heavy hydrogen that we call deuterium was discovered. Um, Again, if anybody wants to go into the science of that, I'm sure there's gold in that. Um, Norway, yeah, Norway was quite strong, harkening back to Eric the Red and saying Greenland owns everything Eric the Red owns. Uh, yeah, here we get now down to Tibetan influence and U.S. government. This was actually a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that allowed the U.S. government to collect all kinds of taxes. Um, oh, this was an interesting one. MDMA was first patented in 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 1913, and that sort of like that put me in a lot of mind of Uttara Bhadrapada, that dream space. That like take a hit of MDMA and you've got all kinds of crazy things happening, right? So things start merging together, ideas and all of this. Um, it's I've never done MDMA that I know of. But it's often heralded as a sort of like really mind opening, mind altering drug. And I think part of that is because it's sort of maybe like ayahuasca. It sort of brings together the spiritual and the material, or rather, it sort of makes them switch places in a sense. And this is, I think, we talk about mythology, and we talk about Bhadrapada. It's such a mythological placement, just that dreamscape. But that's really what these things are. A lot of our mythological creatures are our imagination putting different parts of reality together. Because as Nostradamus reminds us, in a sense, our imagination, it can't go beyond reality, really. It can only take the different parts of it and use that to assemble things. So this kind of stuff, there was a Mexican revolution started back and then, the whole Tibetan independence thing. Um, I assumed the Woolworth building was going to bring something interesting. I couldn't, only that the Woolworth building was maybe similar to some of these train connections. And and some logistic things that might be going on with Uttara Bhadrapada. Maybe Ketu as well is solving some of these problems. But you saw some kind of logistic type hubs. Woolworth building was maybe that, but it was like a department store, one of the first like really big department stores in the USA. Um, anyways, it seems like it should have significance. So it was actually the previous Dalai Lama in Tibet that that claimed the independence from China. I'm not sure. I think if we go back to the next period. Um, anyways, before all of that happened, Britain went in and sort of sacked Tibet, overruled Tibet, and then sort of British Secret Services was kind of ruling. There seemed to be a lot of that. Again, it's that sort of switching of seats. It's that puppet government stuff seemed to come up a lot all the way through this sort of area. It's interesting here we get the pitman's skull. It was an ancient skull that was found. This was found to be a hoax, but when we come up to the previous period, there was some major discoveries, anything of Neanderthalic bones and things buried deep under the ground kind of idea. Still digging on a little bit of this research from way back when. This is before the First World War now. Oh, here we go. Horseless carriages, the first automobile. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's right. First automobile, back then it was like horseless and now we're going driverless, right? Um, kind of ideas. And so that was very exciting, the invention of the automobile. Oh yeah. So these kind of things. I loved when I was young, I was all over this history of North America way back in this period, the whole cowboys and Indians things. I was a little bush boy, right? And so I thought I was basically a little white boy living with all the Indians, and so I thought I was an Indian, right? Like little Mowgli with the wolves. Um, so here we get the Uttara Falguni side of this. And that's like I say this kind of stuff, and it's funny. It's like it's so that switching of places again, right? Almost like being in the wrong place, but it works out right in a sense. I don't know how to explain it. Um, Wearing another man's shoes and they fit. So so here now we're getting the Uttara Bhadrapada side. Denobia on this side, she's a little bit inauspicious. Now we're getting the Sun and Saturn rather than Moon and Saturn. And this is really where the big enmity comes in. The moon is the moon and Saturn, they don't like each other. The moon is mama. She's like, okay, Saturn, I understand you're the crippled boy and blah blah blah, but I'm still gonna take care of you. And so there's not the animosity that we get as we get between Saturn and Sun. There's a lot of animosity here. Here we get Ahriman, the great patron, and on the other side is the serpent of the deep. A little bit it's an interesting combination because Ahriman is or serpent of the deep is often sort of the a pillar of society in a sense. The pillar of no, maybe that's sorry, I might be getting into sort of about the product. God, I get so confused when I'm doing this stuff. Um, um, so anyways, we get the great patron and we get the great serpent, the moon who's making it rain. Um, this does make me think of like there was a novel I read years ago, and maybe it got turned into a movie, the Rainmaker kind of idea. And I saw that theme sort of came up a lot here, like Jiddu Krishnamurti, for example. He was raised by Annie Besant of the Theosophical Society. He had these great patrons, right? So he's just like little Indian boy. And I can just imagine these women back then just doting over this little kid. He wasn't very good in school, but he was great at like he was very again, that sort of militaristic spirituality, right? Up before dawn and doing all his practices and chick, 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 sort of doing everything he could. Then he was very charismatic. Um, we're starting to get into that almost Uttara Falguni, even on the Virgo side, it's that kingly nature is coming into this sort of. And so here especially we get that switching of seats of the king and the pauper as what seems to be going on here. Krishnamurti. So anyway, so the Theosophical Society, let's just scroll down to him because oh, he's in the next phase. Sorry. Let's do that. This is Rahu and Ketu. I can confuse us all I want. Um I should tell you, I feel like this class is a license to sow confusion. Um where the heck is he? There we go. Where is he? I lost him. Um There he is, Krishnamurti. So here we see with Krishnamurti, we see my favorite Robinson Davies, there's Catherine of Oregon, Clay Walker. Here's where some of this, we'll go to a little humorous and we'll go back to Krishnamurti. So Clay Walker, he was a country music singer. I put his diagnosis there. I'm not sure if it relates. I think it might. I did see, I did see a lot of people close, not these people with this placement, but people close to these people dying of tuberculosis or quite early in life. A lot of these people seem to be very close to someone who's dying of I want to call it tuberculosis or Rahu disease, but so they become very fascinated with these kind of things. But Clay Walker's music was kind of funny. And I like this because it points I could make a living out of loving you. I'd be a millionaire in a week or two. Was the song. And so that kind of went with this patron theme in a sense. And that was like Krishnamurti got sort of really, really rich overnight. Like he had people, someone gave him a castle at some point, and then he walked away from all of that. He was like, "This is all actually foolish and nonsense, and I don't believe in it, and I'm leaving." They called him the world teacher, and so he was basically supposed to be the kind of a new guru for the Theosophical Society in a sense. Um, and so he came up and he said, "No, I don't believe in any cults. I don't believe in any dogmas. I don't believe in any, like, don't follow anyone. Follow your own path. Just take from everywhere sort of idea." And so I think he was, I can't remember. I think he was still in his 30s and early 30s when he left the Theosophical Society and he left. It was like the Grand Order of the Rising Sun or something like that. Um, and so he left all that. And so he returned to Castle. And so this is that sort of this the patrons are like just they gave him everything, and he was like, "No, I don't want it." It's that ambivalence sort of coming in over that patronage. Osho is a nice one to see here because I think he used this patronage. He was brilliant. He was one of these like I think he was maybe the first troll guru. And so he owned like 99 Rolls Royces, and he got so much criticism for this. I think he just did it to annoy his critics. And a lot of what Osho did, I think he did it very intentionally just to annoy his critics. And so there is again some of that trolling stuff or that changing of places stuff coming into there. And that sort of like, in another sense, he had all these patrons. Um, I don't know if he was kind of making fun of them as well, in a sense, when he was doing this, because it's like it doesn't show a lot of respect for your patrons, right? Like if one of you were to like give me $50,000 today, and then tomorrow I just went out and bought I want to say a Porsche, but you can't get a Porsche for $50,000. But I got some kind of $50,000 used car, um, then then it wouldn't be showing very much respect to you, right? It would be that sort of like that Ketu kind of ambivalence, like I don't really see the value in any of this somehow. So there's that. Um, Krishnamurti's first book was The Feet of the Guru. I pointed that out. He had pancreatic cancer, is what he died from. Um, but the foot of the Guru is one of these nakshatras rolls over the feet, and so he threw that in as well. The other thing is like Krishnamurti, Victor Hugo, even Clay Walker to a certain sense. Catherine of Oregon, Robertson Davies, all of these people, even Joseph Conrad, all of these people were sort of born into this, what seems like a fairly wealthy life. And there was a lot of ceremony and this kind of thing sort of going on around them all the time. And they were just numb to it. They just didn't care. Robertson Davies is a nice example of it. Um, well, he became master of Massey College, which was a Catholic or Anglican university within the University of Toronto or something like that. But anyway, so he was basically the master of ceremonies. Um, he was always called on. He was like, even you go, some of his books are written from speeches from his Masters of Ceremonies program. And so he was the great master of ceremonies. But he wrote a lot of books under an alias, Samuel Marchbanks, which was the sort of didn't care about any of it at the same time. We saw that as well with like Joseph Conrad. They said that about a lot about him. They say he seemed very conceited. And I think a lot of these people come off very conceited, actually. And that might be more on the Leo side of things. Because now we're starting to cross our first really big boundary, guys. Um, and so we're taking that flip side onto the Leo Aquarius side in this as well. But there does seem to be a lot of conceit to it. But it's like I have it and I don't care conceit, right? Or maybe it's I don't even see what I have sort of conceit. And so we see that kind of thing. An interesting thing about Robertson Davies here, we talked about all the driverless cars and carriages and things. He never learned to drive in his whole life. He never got a driver's license. And so his wife had to drive him around. And so, anyways, back in those days, he probably got a lot of lighthearted ribbing for that, you could say. Because he was quite a manly man as well, the big beard and the big patron guru figure, really. So here we are founding the FBI, a big police chief sort of character having this. Albert Camus was also involved in the resistance, the French resistance, which wasn't quite policing, but probably became very close to that. Some of Joseph Conrad's merchant marine type stuff was sort of a security, you could say, in a sense, was probably a very big part of his job as well. And so we see that becomes quite strong in here. We saw the MDMA was invented. We see here the guy who discovered morphine has this combination, and so there's a great. I've had morphine. That's a great dream drug. You want to go out there? It's wonderful. I remember I was. This is actually a little bit Uttara Bhadrapada. I remember when I used to work construction back in those days. That was my other life, right? Um, I was caved in on. And so I was down in the ditch and everything caved in on me and I was half buried and wow, it was a big thing. And they dug me out. It was just in the nick of time. And wow, and they got me to the hospital and it was a work accident. Hospitals treat you a little bit. You get like VIP service when it's work accidents a little bit. If you do something stupid, you wait until the work accident guy gets. So I was getting VIP service. So as soon as I got to the hospital, they gave me the shot of morphine. And I remember it was my first time getting like the shot of morphine, right? And I remember just going like, wow, wow. I loved it. I gotta say, guys, that was some really, really good stuff. But the dreaming nature of it was just never had anything like it before. So we get that sort of, I think, Uttara Falguni Uttara Falguni is ruled by the sun. So we're getting some of that illuminating nature. Like I remember that with the morphine, and it's probably because it was like I had one hit of morphine. I'm sure if I had 100 hits, the sun would set. But there was like almost an awareness that came with the dream. It was really kind of cool. Um, talk about that. I don't remember this David B fellow. He um he dealt with a lot of lighting. He was like in the rental business for Hollywood, rental supply business, but mostly lighting and cameras is what he was dealing with. Oh, that was another thing I saw happen here early. Is that gonna be here? No, that's up here. Sorry, now we're scrolling around, guys. We're really asking for trouble. Um, so yeah, we talked about the human rights thing. The Rockefeller Foundation was also sort of founded here. We can see George Soros has placements here. That sense of trust is starting to come in regards to like trusts or like savings trusts or foundations or for the future kind of thing, the patronage sort of trusts or foundations. And so start to see that kind of coming into the Uttara Falguni side of this. Um, now, when I've done the transits, this is where like no matter how I organize things, there's going to be a wrench thrown in. And so now that we're dealing with Uttara Falguni, now we're dealing with the split between Virgo and Leo. So I expect some of the dualities to become especially strong. I haven't divided that in the transits because it's just too much. Um, because then some periods that are short, it's like going to be a period there that's a month and a period there that God, I just can't imagine. But we get some of that. We see here Death Valley, California reaches one of its highest 57 degrees Celsius. Um, I saw in some other places, I think at one point London had a big heat wave it was its hottest. And so we see that maybe it's the son of Hasta, maybe it's the son of Uttara Falguni that's coming in here, because the sun still plays out in different ways in both of these. But the sun seems to be getting a lot of power with this Ketu. So the sun becoming very, very strong, both in a patronage way and in a very cruel kind of way. I remember reading about Krishnamurti and a lot of these, I can only picture it as these doddering old ladies at the Theosophical Society, doddering, trying to mold this young Krishnamurti into this world leader. And so they wanted him to have a certain presentation, so they're dressing him in a certain way and really cutting his hair and really molding him into this sort of a character. And it was almost sad to me because they talk about how he maintained this through his whole life, this character that he was kind of molded and shaped into becoming. Um, and I didn't see it as a victory for for God. I didn't see it a victory for anything. Krishnamurti, I love Krishnamurti. I have nothing bad to say about Krishnamurti, but I think he had a very hard life. He teaches freedom and freedom from the dogmas, but he grew up so bound within a dogma, right? And so then he left and sort of took the other seat. The other thing I started to see a lot happening in the Uttara Falguni was well, he kind of abandoned his patronage positions in a sense and returned castles and God knows what else he returned. But he also abandoned some love affairs. And with some of these characters, it was almost like because of their position, they couldn't love, right? And so later on, they had some sort of like very secretive love affairs. Robertson Davies has kind of a neat book, Rebels Angels, um, and it talks a lot about the love affairs between students and their gurus in the university, um, sort of idea. And again, these kind of like forbidden loves, maybe it is, or these with its Ketu, maybe you call it an alien kind of love. Really big. differences. Even Joseph Conrad's wife, nobody could figure out what Joseph Conrad was doing with this woman. Um, so these strange loves may be coming in. And I found more often than not, these people sort of had to abandon the great love of their life or something like that at some point. Quite, quite sad. Um, so we get that thing. Oh, we see here, yeah, before the Rockefeller Foundation, we see here the Grand Masonic Lodge in France splits away from the Mother Lodge of the Freemasons. So that split, that duality, it was almost like the Freemasons broke into two separate parties at that period of time. Um, so this kind of thing, Society of Architects is founded. The Little Lost Child. It's funny, I talked about the feeling this in my own life and a lot of this, and we get into start to get into some of these more royal qualities as we get into Uttara Falguni. Um, and it was funny yesterday. I think I wrote this today, Nave, and oh, I say these things. I shouldn't even share this here, recording this, right? God knows who I'll send this recording to in the future. Um, but this almost like little princess hissy fit I felt myself having yesterday when no one showed up in my class, and I was all sad. And I could just, to me it was just this little princess inside of me just pouting. And Dana was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm ready to redo the class now," and I was like, "No." Um, but you start to get into that sort of what is Uttara Falguni? Not just a patronage, but it's a sort of a privilege sort of comes into that, right? And this kind of thing, that sense of privilege. The little lost child is why I brought up my little princess. Is released here. World's oldest record shop opens, and this first Billboard magazine, um, first feminist stores, Vogue magazine, sort of thing coming out here. But that little sort of princess that gets his feelings hurt and goes away in a sense. And I get a sense that Krishnamurti might have felt that a little bit as well when he went away, because I think what sort of happened with Krishnamurti was he kind of came out as the world leader, but he was mostly ridiculed for it. All the Hindus kind of made fun of him. Even other people in the Theosophical Society sort of ridiculed, maybe not Krishnamurti, but they ridiculed this idea of the world teacher. And so then he sort of also like went away from it and said, "Yeah, you're right. You can't be having," because he was already sort of saying you can't be following any dogma, you can't be following any cults, and then all of a sudden he came out as this world leader, right? And so it didn't really. It was kind of a Annie Besant. She gets a lot of respect, but I just see her as this doddering old lady who should have kept her nose out of things. Um, and I say this with great love, right? I talked about the Dumvati, right? At the beginning, I talked about Dumvati. And so when I say that about Annie Besant, I say it with the greatest love, Annie. Um, the Theosophical Society had a lot of work in Varanasi. So these names like Annie Besant, these I'm just like, I've been immersed in these names for a long, long time. They're just everywhere. Everybody that's coming is just all over this. There's still, if you go to Varanasi, they still have a library, and it's a space that, well, if you sign up, especially who is it? This is maybe good to talk about this a little bit because it's Dumvati. Here's a Dumvati name for you. Oh God, Dana, bail me out. The female guru lady who's always in Varanasi runs the Abhinavagupta library there. Always does a lot of her talks at the Theosophical Society. Baumer, Bettina Baumer. Yeah, yeah. See, you knew it. Um, I knew you knew the answer to that. Um, but she's brilliant. And she's really wonderful. Um, and if you're into like Shaivism and stuff like that, especially on the female guru side of things, right? And she's someone that that all my female guru people should look up. My male gurus too, but I don't know. There was another name that came up in this, and this was really kind of funny. I think it was a just short story writer in Canada, an old school sort of feminist. And I'm like, should I just erase her name? um, um, I don't like what she's preaching. I don't like her books. There's a few old school feminists, and I can't read their books. They're really, really popular. And I think names like Anne Besant are going to be more popular with the women. Same with Bettina Baumer. Has a lot more women followers than men followers. Um, and this is what we're talking about, the polarities and the dualities, right? Men and women are sitting on different sides of the table. We see the world in very different ways. And so we also see these gurus in different ways. And they have something else to give us, right? Like right off the bat, once you hear that someone like Bettina Baumer is a female guru, the women are going to feel like she has something to give them that she doesn't have to give me right off the bat, right? She's a role model as a woman for you. As a woman, she's not a role model for me. She has knowledge and wisdom I respect, but she doesn't fit that same place, you could say. Anyways, Rahu and Ketu, I'm just chewing on my own foot here, probably. Um, but actually, one of my leave it alone, Mike. One of the people that I quite respect and I quite love, and I follow her work online. Um, she got into a bunch of feminist stuff recently that kind of made me go, oh, and I was very surprised coming from her. Because she's usually above that. So, anyways, but we get into these sort of switchings of places as well, right? And things like this. I've talked about my own switching of places, and here's why I talk about cheering on my own foot, because my own switching of places, because I've talked about my own situation of, at least in the West, I really feel everything I do in the West is kind of really more women's job and women's sort of work. Um, and so as a man, I don't get the kind of much respect for it. When I go to India, I get a lot more respect for my work, and it's not seen as sort of women's work quite as much. And so, anyways, I'm saying bad things about the women, and it can't be good for business. No, I started off complaining about business, right? And here I am just making my business worse. So here we go. The women in Australia become the first women to gain the vote. We talked about that, some of that civil rights stuff in the earlier days, being more about the women's rights. There was also some in those earlier days, a little bit with the natives' rights as well, I saw coming up. Um, the rights of local people seem to be big. And really, when we look into things like the Vietnam War, that was a local people against a sort of a puppet government, right? Taiwan whole thing, the local people sort of against these puppet governments. And so things like that start coming up. Um, where are we? Yeah, I wanted to come down to this Purva Bhadrapada and Uttara Falguni, because we didn't do this one yet. No, we didn't. Um, so here we get what seems to me, we get the Pegasus, and we get coming into the lion. And so we get these two, wow, incredible mythological creatures coming involved. It's kind of oh wow, name down here. It is. So we're getting something that to me is resembling a manticore in regards to the mixed creatures. Robertson Davies wrote a book, The Manticore. That's why that suddenly popped out at me. Um, but we get the lion and the Pegasus. I think there is actually a sphinx. Don't the Egyptians have like a flying lion or some flying lion or something like that? And so, anyways, we got into some could be some interesting stuff in there. Here we get the polarity of the planets is Jupiter, Mercury. Sun, Saturn is still going on one side. Jupiter and Mercury are going
Isn't,
on.
sorry, Mike, isn't the ruler of Purva Bhadrapada Jupiter?
Oh, there we go. You are correct. There we go. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but half of his sign rulership is still Saturn. Um, there's going to be a lot of those little mistakes all the way through this. Um, even on the dates, sometimes I'm filling in dates and I'm like, oh, wait a sec, that's from the 60s, not the 30s. Um, so there is a, there's one on Dalai Lama. First, he leaves Tibetan for the roundtable talks. And then it's like a week later, I have him getting released from prison. The release from prison is wrong. If you come across that. So, anyways, um, but here we get the one-footed goat versus the Aryaman. This is also the one-footed goat gets very electric, very. So now I think we're getting into a lot of like strong power, power plays, power movements in a sense. Um, the one with beautiful feet and the later reddish one. The reddish one is the later reddish one. Because you have earlier reddish ones, Uttara Falguni, but you also have other reddish ones in Rohini. Um, and so here we're getting a glow. We're getting the really strong, sort of sunny nature essentially here. Um, Apollo becomes the ruler. We see all through this stretch. One of the things I'm sort of watching, maybe even more than even the nodes in the signs, I'm trying to sort of we see a whole stretch of Apollo. What could you say? Space exploration sort of idea, right? The whole period of this Apollo space exploration. We're seeing this whole periods, and again, I'm expecting like whole periods of communism to be getting more popular. Whole periods that go beyond the single nakshatras, you could say. Um, because I'm sort of I don't know. I'm seeing this as that great battle of the two sides, the two polar universal forces. And those forces aren't pinpricks, right? Those forces are these massive forces that take up, well, and that's what Rahu and Ketu are. They're not these exact pinprick forces like today it's in Purva Bhadrapada, tomorrow it's, we'll never get anywhere to look at the nodes that way. There's going to be some blending, there's going to be some crossing, there's going to be some haziness and some mistiness to everything about them. But we get Bhairava. We get Lord Bhairava here. The skull and crossbones is going on. All of that kind of stuff. It's funny they often talk about Bhairava. This courage of the lion, in a sense, comes up with Bhairava. Here we're getting the soles of the feet, the lips, the sex organs, these kinds of things. We think of Bhairava and the Bhairava tantras and the sexy tantras, we see that coming in with the Uttara Falguni. But the Purva Bhadrapada side as well is this Aj Ekpada, this devilly form, right? This form of darkness, you could say, is really starting to come together here. The male lion and the cow. And so the Purva Bhadrapada sexual energy just wants to eat that king in a sense. Um, and it's very, very strong, you could say that way. They say the place, they called the place the house in the south. I don't know if there's a a better place description for that than the house in the south. But the house in the south is very well descriptive for Bhadrapada. That idea of when things are going south, right? Is an Uttara Falguni does seem like quite the opposite of that, right? When things are going good, man, especially the first pada in Leo, that's a really auspicious sort of placement. And so we get that kind of duality here. We got a nice complementary in the colors, the silver gray and the bright great blue. Um, that way, where's our tree? Oh, the Rudraksha and the mango tree. Geez, I seem to have just put mango in as a placeholder for everybody's tree. I'll have to go look at that. Um, so, but mangoes are good, man. They balance all the doshas, and so maybe they fit in many places. Um, they do. They balance all the doshas. They're so sweet and tasty. It's hard for me to imagine a mango as a Purva Bhadrapada tree, though. Um, although Purva Bhadrapadas probably do need mangoes more than anybody else. So, um, because they're kind of that was another thing that came up in a lot of these people, like even Krishnamurti. A lot of them were kind of sickly when they were younger. Um, Poor health, low energy somehow. A lot of those kind of things came in. He's sort of like picked on as kids, right? Even a lot of them didn't do that well in school. Very, very intelligent, a lot of them, but didn't do that well in school, really. A lot of them also had very privileged places, and so went to kind of privileged schools and probably got through school even by privilege in a sense. Um, but anyways, they're brilliant people nonetheless, right? Um, I did very well in earlier school, school generally. I did very well at everybody. I was always supposed to become like a lawyer or a doctor. I was supposed to stay in school until I was 50 years old. Um, and then I love the ideal of school. But the actual places and the institutions I don't have much use for at all. Um, and I get a sense, again, I get a sense a lot of these people felt the same way in a lot of ways. There seems to be a lot of that sort of duality, that kind of blending of things that don't fully make sense. It's interesting to get the skull and crossbones here because we are getting more into that. Jiddu Krishnamurti was supposed to be the big Guruji, and Victor Hugo was well, we know him for the Hunchback of Notre Dame and probably especially Les Miserables. And he did a lot of work for the poor. But he was elected into the Senate in France as well. And his father was like a general in the Napoleonic Wars. And so he grew up a lot like, I want to say Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti was actually kind of poor until Annie Besant took him over. His father worked for Annie Besant, right? So that's how he got involved in the whole Theosophical Society. Um, So, but anyways, after French overthrew the king, the whole French Revolution time, they overthrew their king, and he said, "No, now you overthrew the throne. Now you have to overthrow the scaffold." And we see some of that scaffolding building up in Purvanashad, and so that's got to go as well. Um, that sort of stuff. That Hunchback of Notre Dame, that marked one, that the accursed one, sort of in a sense, the condemned, the last day of a condemned man. I don't know if you guys have heard of this book, but this was very, very influential on like Gandhi and a lot of people. Hugo was working to abolish slavery at his time, well before it was popular to do that. He was trying to abolish the death penalty in France as well. That's sort of what Les Miserables deals with. The With that sense of patronage, like he came from this really wealthy place, and he was giving a lot of patronage to a lot of poorer people. Judo Krishnamurti, he was also giving a lot of patronage to so many people. Clay Walker after his multiple sclerosis. He just gave all his money to multiple sclerosis. Um, Catherine of Aragon, maybe the first feminist that ever lived, in a sense. Um, she was certainly most famous for having the worst husband of any man. So, any women watching this, you want to complain about your husband, just have a look at Catherine of Aragon, and you'll be like, "Oh wow, my husband is a wonderful man." Um, and same with your children. If you think your children is bad, look at Catherine of Aragon's child, Queen Bloody Mary. She put a whole bunch of people, burnt a whole ton of people on the stake. But that was kind of the thing to do those days. So that wasn't really a big deal. Um, but that's that Purva Bhadrapada, right? It brings almost something like a curse in there. Even Catherine of Aragon, she was first betrothed to Henry's older brother. And so she came over. She was like this brilliant woman. She was like, you can't imagine a better queen. She had the education and the upbringing. She was somehow connected with the English, so that this marriage with this family would kind of like they someone said that she probably had more right to the throne than King Henry VIII, actually. So she was like really involved in that. Getting into the patronage and the kingly stuff, something else that's coming up a lot in this, and Purva Bhadrapada gets into this as well, is genetics, genetic lineage type things sort of become important. And so we see that with, well, Kathleen of Aragon, things are maybe getting mixed up a little bit, is what's happening with the lineage or something. Um, that's really what Saturn is all about, actually, isn't he? And he's the ruler here. No, sorry, Dana. Um, but he's got a little corner of Aquarius still. But anyways, even if we think of Jupiter, this is where people say astrology is a sham because you can make it all work. And so now I'll kick it over to Jupiter and we'll say the same thing because Jupiter had illegitimate children. Um, After what the heck happened, the moon came and slept with his wife, right? And had children. Oh yeah, he had Mercury. And so now we're seeing that Mercury Jupiter split here. Um, and so we're seeing that illegitimate sort of, maybe some of it is a guru teacher sort of a thing. But that sort of illegitimate raising of children and kind of thing. And that's like Robertson Davies as God, I got put a quote here. Yeah. Wisdom may be rented on the experience of other people, but we buy it at an inordinate price before we make it our own forever. And so that's kind of, I don't know. That's why I want to involve you guys in all the research I'm doing and all of this. I think about it sometimes what I'm doing here, and I'm like, who does a course while they're writing the book? Aren't you supposed to write the book and then do the course? I don't know. I get confused about these things, but I think there's something really special in sharing the process. Isn't that what we always say? The process is important. The journey is important. And so it's like, well, let's so now we're here on this journey. And so I'm hoping that if I have any wisdom to share on my path, that you're not just renting it. I can hope you can buy it and by being here. So thank you. Um, But in every church, there are people who, for reason which seems sufficient to them, do not approve of their pastor, and they seek to harry and bully him in some condition pleasing to themselves. The democracy which the Reformation brought into the Christian church rages in their bosoms like a fire, and they would deny that they regard their clergyman to the spiritual hired hand, whom they boss and oversee for his own good, but it's certain the impression they give to observers. So he's talking about this about pastors, and this is kind of, I think, that position of patron in a sense. And we often think of patron as someone who's giving money, but patron is also that teacher, but that one that's sharing wisdom as well. Comes out in here. And so he's sort of saying, like, a lot of these people sort of look at their clergymen and they make fun of them, they bully them. I get that in spiritual circles as well. It's like as soon as you sort of bill yourself as any sort of a spiritual person, someone's going to come along and say, "Oh, you smoke. Oh, you eat meat. Oh, you." They're going to find anything you do that doesn't look spiritual to people, right? And so that kind of a little bit of that is sort of happening. I got that a little bit of the rights movements as well is sort of involved in a little bit of that posturing in a sense, right? Um, and that kind of thing kind of comes in. That leaven of malice that Davies sort of writes about in his books that comes out. And oh, I'm the guiltiest one of this. Don't worry. Like we're gonna get into Brawley. I've trashed Brawley about as much as I can. I love that man. I've studied all his books. Like, what can I say? Um, right. And I've trashed probably every astrology guru there is out there, and I trash myself equally. And I think there is something of that into I sometimes see it as a Mars thing, as a brotherhood thing. Right? It's like sometimes if you're hanging out with your brothers and your siblings and no one's making fun of you, nobody's telling you your hair looks funny today, nobody's telling you your outfit doesn't match. Whatever it is, like we talk about that with women being catty, but it's like kind of how they show you love, right? And well, here we're dealing with Ketu is getting into the Leo. And so there's going to be some strange ways also of showing love. Um, I can see Dana there, like she's petting her dog, and that shows love to an animal. Sometimes it can show love to a human, but if you pet a human just the way she's petting a dog, probably not going to jive, right? You got just a little different way we do the touch, and she'll do the thing behind the ear with the dog, and we do that with humans, and humans love that kind of thing. Um, so we get into like some anti-heroes of Joseph Conrad, these sort of characters that the anti-hero is this character that you can't like very much, but you can't help but sort of see them as a hero nonetheless. And that's sort of an anti-hero. But he talked, I'll let you read his quote because it's really broken up and it's hard to read. But he's just talking about living away from the natural environment, friends, family, social group. Maybe it's not that hard to read, even if it results in conscious decision. It usually brings internal tensions because we're always sort of having to adjust ourselves. This is the life of the traveler, right? You're always in a new group. You're always having to kind of like, well, in a sense, prove your place, find a position within that new society to a certain degree. And you see that with a
The
lot of these. Oh, go ahead.
the trees that you had in were correct for Purva Bhadrapada, but you also had indica written in brackets. So I'm not sure if you meant the cannabis strain, but that's kind of fitting with what you're discussing a bit.
Sorry, where am I looking?
In the Nakshatra project, you have indica written beside Purva Bhadrapada in the trees, as well as mango and the
Okay.
other one.
Indica is usually that's just a plant classification of an Indian variety. So it's like when we think of indica weed, which is really popular. Um, I don't know if they haven't legalized weed everywhere, but now it's legalized. Everybody knows indica and sativa in Canada. Now they're very popular words, but indica is just that's like the traditional indica Indian variety, Himalayan variety. Um, and indica, that's kind of I found that interesting as well. So we're going to wander, right? MDMA and all the dream drugs are here as well. So indica is actually, and maybe I did mean it as marijuana, because indica would fit in with a Pisces plant in some ways. Because India is the variety that makes you, it kind of brings you down, right? It's like the couch potato variety of the weed, where the sativa picks you up and it makes you all creative and makes you kind of, yeah. But of course, with any of these drugs, it's that duality. It's like we smoke the sativa and it sort of gives you energy, but you smoke your 10th sativa joint and you crash like a rock. You just fall and that's it, and you're done. And indica will kind of do the opposite. You first smoke it and it makes you really dopey, but then it starts to you smoke it and then you can't sleep anymore, kind of idea. And so there's always that switching of places that seems to be happening in this duality. Remember Sanjay talking to me that about that with any addiction. Um, how you do it long enough and it starts to give you the opposite effects. It's like coffee addicts, right? They drink coffee and they get really tired. Um, so these sorts of things. And so I think there is some of that effect in these placements. Back up. There you go. I think I finished going through this. Victor Hugo. Oh no, I did go through all that. Look at that. Did I go through all this? I went through all that too. I was seeing some. What are we here? Bhadrapada and Uttara. I was seeing some because the Winter Olympics in Calgary, that was my birth city, was Calgary. It's a very cowboy place. And so that was like a very cowboy themed kind of Winter Olympics, I can quite imagine. In the Saddle Dome is actually the big phrase for that. And I expect some of this maybe in Purva Falguni a little bit more, because that's usually the prince sitting up on the big horse there. But I was getting things seemed to be a little bit of like this cowboy energy. And by that I mean this kind of energy, a lot of energy of independence seemed to be going through these nakshatras to a certain degree. Here we go. There's the first man on the moon, and the gay rights coming out, Woodstock sort of independence, Britain versus IRA. That really got kicked up to an ex-lodge back in '69. Um, yeah, the winter, that sort of cowboy theme of the Winter Olympics that went on here. See, it kind of broke down a little bit because the whole Iraq-Iran war wasn't about independence. As far as I can tell, that was strictly about acquiring land. I think Saddam Hussein was probably doing some bidding for America in that war, but there was the chemical attacks that came out then. Still seeing a little bit of that chemically stuff that we were seeing earlier with Revati and Badra. Yeah, here we saw in Czechoslovakia the first mass demonstrations against socialism started to come out there, and this is right around the couple years later the Berlin Wall came down, right? So this was really the end of the end for the Soviets. I think there a whole bunch more like civil rights type protests start breaking out after this period. Um, and then the whole coming down of the Berlin Wall that must happen in the next period or something. But that was actually almost by accident. Actually, it was two countries just loosened some of their border regulations, a Soviet and a Western country, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 the whole thing just collapsed like dominoes. And next thing you know, the right in Berlin, it came down. So here we had some British IRA type stuff going on. Um, and here it's the Korean War. And this again, this is more Cold War stuff ultimately. Um, North and South Korea. And so this was the first year of the war. Bhadra, do we want to get into this? Do you have any questions so far? Oh God, we had to go through. We do have to go through Purva Bhadra if we have any chance to go through this. So I thought I was doing all right by time, but I'm actually further more behind than I thought. Way behind. So far behind, I think I'm in front. Switching places, right? Um, we saw some of those in the Purva Bhadrapada and Uttara Falguni. We started seeing some of these Rockefeller foundations. We saw Soros born up there. Here we get into the bankers, Charlemagne, Oprah's husband. He's all into the pay of investments and stuff. He's the one that sort of did all the investments for her money. Um, got Alexander Dumas. I got to figure out what he wrote. Hunchback of Notre Dame, Les Miserables. Jeepers, I got all confused. So here we go. We get into some. This Ketu is coming into Purva Falguni. This gives me almost a fairly like someone like Charlemagne, for example. I remember who was it? Diogenes. I fashioned myself after Diogenes. I think I'm just like him. Anyways, but was it Charlemagne? No, it was Alexander the Great. Same person. Anyways, these kind of I know my mind is just like too many names, too much history. But I got this sort of vision with the Ketu and Purva Falguni. Purva Falguni is like the knight in shining armor, right? And he's sitting up on his horse, right? And Diogenes was kind of looking down in his bath barrel on the street. And Alexander the Great came to talk to him. And of course, Diogenes should have been honored. And he said, "Excuse me, sir, but you're standing in my light." Um, and that's sort of like this Ketu is blocking the prince. But I don't get it with a Ketu. I don't see it as this sort of like dark night shadow in front of the sun. I see it as this glare of whiteness. You know, a big white horse and a big white knight, and the sun isn't behind him; it's actually in front of him, and it's hitting all the knight's armor and glaring, and you're like, "Oh, I can't see you up there." And so, in a sense, it's like being larger than life in a way, right? Too great to be true. Um, we see that Peter the Great of Russia, however, was he was the potato king. He was very down to earth, and ultimately Charlemagne was as well. That's something with even if you're a great king, right, and being ushered around by everyone like this and how they are, but if you're traveling consistently, anyways, you always have to keep getting well, they have to keep getting down, come back down to earth. But there is something of that that does bring them down from their high horse of the Purva Falguni in a sense, right? Like war, life, the Medicis, the debts and the lending, and there's going to be something that does sort of bring these guys down, even if they are great levels. Someone like William Burroughs, for example, um, down and exploring the gutters. This is the nature of travel. Of course, if I'm really honest with myself, we're into we're into Aquarius now and Leo. And so really, where the heck am I getting this travel from? Because we're out of Pisces. All right. So um if I'm honest, we should say, well, where is the travel coming from? Well, it's a good question. Um, on one hand, it might come because this Ketu, it's going to be in the Leo. Leo has a lot to do with our identity and our egos and all of those sorts of things. And so it's going to, on one hand, take that ego down. But on another hand, it's going to give them the biggest ego there is, right? Like Charlemagne, like Peter the Great. We see some of these explorers, these early African explorers were like these diplomats traveling through the jungle. But then we see guys like Conor McGregor and women like Amanda Nunes, China. The women here, especially, well, it's interesting to see those two names together, China and Amanda Nunes, because they're both like fighters, like powerful, like Xena princess warrior women, mixed martial arts and wrestler kind of characters. But again, it's that on one hand, they have these really big egos, right? They're these wrestling women, and they're just like, "Oh, I'm gonna get out and with the microphone," and they're like, "I'm gonna get out and I'm gonna kick everybody's butt and I'm gonna send you back to hell where you came from," or whatever these wrestlers are saying. It's that big. They're the king of the jungle in a sense, but they do it kind of effortlessly in a way. It's like actually China, from what I've read, I don't know anything about Amanda Nunes, but I did read a little bit about China while I was doing this project. And she was actually sounds like quite a sweet woman in a lot of ways. But this big mean wrestler type character. Um, Kurt Russell is a character. I I might be slandering him, but I think he's the fellow that back in the 60s, early 60s, late 50s. God, was he even alive then? Anyways, maybe I'll slander, maybe I won't. But yeah, I think he was this one that just brutally raped this what was her name? Green. And I've got some histories of her, but just brutally raped this young actress. And just completely got away with it as a 50s Hollywood star would. Um, and so you get some of these sort of brutal things happening on the side. Um, People tell me that Oprah's husband is far from being a very nice fellow at all. It's funny. It's one of those situations. He's married to Oprah Winfrey. He's just a black woman, but everybody tells. I've been told he's complete racist. Um, and so you find these funny changings of seats as well. Um, what does that mean to call someone married to a black woman a racist? I don't really know, but it's a strange world, and it's Rahu and Ketu. And so, like this, Dale Earnhardt's maybe another character. He was a race car driver, again, very big, manly man, but very, he was very, very Christian. He was always like going through what is the mechanic shops, right? All these race car drivers, and he's going through there, and he's basically talking to everybody about Christ and Jesus and things like that. So he was kind of a strange character that way. Um, I just have some small. It's interesting to see the stalemate in the Iraq-Iran war because I saw a stalemate up here in another big war. That was kind of interesting that neither side really winning. I don't have any history at all for that one, so we're down to our last 10 minutes here or so. Is there any questions? Any comments?
I couldn't find the exact date, but I was trying to find when The Little Prince was written. It was published in April 1943, but I'm not sure of the exact month. Reminded
Which
me
one's
when
that?
you were The Little Prince when you were mentioning your moment yesterday.
Yeah, we'll have to look for. Yeah, I was saying I often think of the Little Prince. And of course now we got to Purva Falguni. And I don't know, a Little Prince. Maga is the little king. Um, we get some very princely things in Purva Falguni. We get very patron type things, and so we're getting that kingly sort of egoistical nature. One of the things that came through a lot of these people came off as conceited. Um, and it's funny, I do all this stuff, and I think I get that as well. I think a lot of people think I come off as conceited sometimes as well. It might be might be a traveler defense as well to a certain degree, because you show up around a bunch of kings and you just landed on that island, and so you've got to be as kingly and as anyone, right? And you've got to kind of command some respect maybe with these nodes in Leo is what they're asking, but it's not a again, it's a Dostoevsky, the saber rattler commanding respect, not commanding the respect because they actually deserve it because they actually have done anything. And so we might get some of that kingly nature as the nodes are passing through the Leo side, that false king somehow, maybe false heirs, might come up to a certain degree. Just, just noticing the animals between Purvabhadra and Purva Falguni, the lion and the rat. Um, Now, I don't know if this is true for lions, but I'll bet you it is. It's true for wolves. Farley Mowat did a wonderful wolf study, and and at a time when, like in Canada, they were like killing all the wolves because they're eating our livestock. They're gonna eat our children. These big scary wolves, right? And Farley Mowat went and lived with the wolves and discovered that wolves mostly live off mice. Is their main source of diet is all these like abundance of mice running around. And so I can imagine a male lion is probably also eating a lot of rats. Um, it's probably a main source. They can find these little rat colonies once in a while, and lions are just in heaven. Um, House to the south and the ruined house. It seems to be the same thing to me. What's the difference? Um, Light brown, silver gray, north and west. Just as in Purva Falguni, I've got Mondetta, the goddess of money here, sort of a some modern literature. I'm sure one of these literary guys we've been dealing with has called money the bitch goddess at some point. Um, which again, I hate to tie that in with Bhairava and Dumvati, but you might think of all of that sort of as kind of a bitch goddess, as kind of a bitch god. Um, in a sense, the Bhairava side is like life is a bitch, guys. And once you accept that, Bhairava treats you fairly much better. If you take that a step forward and realize that well, we all die. That's the ultimate bitch in life. And when you can accept that, then Bhairava is really good to you. It's that fear of death, that fear of like maybe not having any money, that fear of not having, that fear comes in and destroys our life the way the Numbati will destroy a life, in a sense. Numbati's an interesting character. I remember when I was a kid, I grew up in these small Canadian towns, and I think all small Canadian towns have a similar myth. And somewhere in that small town is an ancient old man or woman, widowed, living alone. They've got no more friends. Their house and their yard aren't kept. And maybe it's the job of some little boy in town to take care of that house and yard. But there's a myth along all the little kids in that town that that old person has like a gold bar, a fortune stashed under their bed or something, right? Then there's something in that old haunted house of those old people. And maybe that's why mom and dad say go mow their lawn, right? They have something for you. And maybe it's the old person who's like, hey, little kids, I have candy. And when I was a kid, you went and took candy from strangers. It wasn't a problem. Um, and so maybe it's that old person who always has some sweet and the best thing at Halloween and something like that. But there's a lot of that energy coming through this sort of section of transit. That patron, right? That old woman who has the great, I don't know, cupcakes at Halloween when everybody else is just giving candy, right? And so that Monday, that, and here we're seeing also, well, we're seeing Ketu and Purva Falguni, and so it's just really blinded to that light of the Savior maybe that's where we were seeing some of the puppet type governments was coming in with that sort of savior and being blinded to that, right? Because it's like, God, who's doing it now? Oh God, I don't know. Someone is now taking U.S. American patronage. No, Ukraine. We'll just say Ukraine is taking all this U.S. American patronage as if it's a good idea or going to be good for something Ukraine, and everybody can see it hasn't done Ukraine any good at all. Um, but somewhere there's that blinded, right? That blinded to the great American savior is going to come in and fix everything for our country. Um, yeah, I don't know. 5 minutes. Any questions?
I was just gonna say that this specific, like Purva Falguni and Purva Bhadrapada always makes my mind a bit confused because personally I have Jupiter in Purva Bhadrapada and Venus in Purva Falguni. And it's so interesting to me that Jupiter is the ruler of the one that looks like the house of Venus. If you think about like Venus, the teacher, like the more tantric, the shadow, more connected to Bhairava, more connected to the front legs of a funeral cot, but it's Jupiter. So there's like that double face of what's behind. And then on the other side, it's like the delight. Of course, it's also Venus, but it's more like, I see it more the other way around. Like Venus should be ruling this side, Jupiter should be ruling this, but both of them are ruling the gold behind the broken house. Like nothing is what it seems. So this polarity, I'm interested to look more into your document about like the historical events, and I really think it has to do with things are not as they seem, like we say in tantra, right? Like not at all as
Yeah,
they seem. Like it looks like you're helping but you're not, it looks like you're not helping but you are, or things like this.
exactly that switch was really strong. I think it was maybe more because duality of the signs that they're in. But I think this Rahu and Ketu is going to bring this switch somehow all the way through. And it's interesting what you say about that duality. It's like your Jupiter is there with Venus intellectualizing what you should be enjoying. And your Venus is over there um enjoying what you should be intellectualizing, maybe. Um, I'm going to have something similar come up with this. Now, it's a funny thing in my chart. If we look at the polarity of these nodes, you get a Jyeshta Migrashirsha polarity. And that's my sun and moon. Now they're kicked to the side a little bit. So my sun and moon aren't in the same signs, but they're in the matching polarity nakshatras, if I can say something that makes no sense. So anyways, we'll get this in our charts a lot, these polarities, and so it will be interesting. And as you see, there's lots of room for you to look into that if you want. But I'll probably be on this one today. It's where I've gotten to today. Um, you can see how much this document changed in 2 days. So imagine what you're going to get next weekend. Um, so so it's wonderful that I'm really first class. I was just on the surface. I wasn't into it at all. Now I'm fully into Rahu and Ketu. Every part of this is going to be my life, and it's going to be hell. But damn it, I'm going to enjoy it. Um, oh God, it's going to be. So yeah, if anyone wants to chat, I'll stick around after classes as well to talk. But I'll just say they have. You have a comment first before I?
I tried to write a note in the form of a question, but it's kind of just like thought vomit. It was more relating to the one above, but the ruler's still the sun in the one that Dana just mentioned. I was kind of wondering if the energy coming through in that one's sort of like the separation, sort of trying to like split away from like the external ego of what the like. It's kind of resonating with me because I have a Purva Bhadrapada moon, so I grew up in a home where this could also be the Swati sun, but my upbringing was very you do this in public, you don't do this in public. So my brain, I always have dual lines of thought at all times. And I'm kind of realizing the more I get older, one is the true me and one is just like the trauma trying to tell me to follow what my upbringing and everything around me wanted. But I'm kind of wondering, like a Rahu Ketu sense, if it's like stripping that societally with those placements.
I think there is some of that, yeah, stripping some of the, yeah, the not what you're in a sense, especially up in the Pisces area, it's like that's behind closed doors. And so Rahu is sort of like, oh, well, I can get advantage of what's going on by behind closed doors in a sense. So he brings that all out. And it's in a way, it's like, well, it's like what I always say about capitalism, communism. They both have their place in their right place. Like it's perfectly fine to fart and burp and spit in your home, right? But don't fart and burp and spit out in public. But what this transit is doing is bringing the farting and burping and the spitting out into the public. So yeah.
I feel like I was reverse taught a lot growing up. It was like I would be taught something and then I would do that and it would be like, no, that's not at all how it's actually supposed to go. And then I would go back and be like, but I did what you said. And it would be like, no, I never said that. So I was like kind of told to do it and then forced to learn the lesson. So it's kind of resonating in terms of you do.
That's
Learning
some
a
of
lot
the
about a lot.
Bhadrapada is kind of just expect to always be wrong when you're a Bhadrapada. Bhadrapadas almost can't be right in a way. It's just it's kind of the curse of Bhadrapada. Even if you're right, expect to be wrong. So and if you're like a Maga or Purva Falguni, you can expect to just always be right, even when you're wrong. That's the joy of being the king. And that's what sucks about being the pauper. So Mahadev, guys, I'm just gonna shut the recording off, but I'll still be here.